Plato's Euthyphro by Dr. Israelsen. So let's begin by looking at the setting of this Platonic dialogue. Plato writes almost exclusively in dialogues, with Socrates, his teacher, being one of his his kind of standard main character. Socrates and Plato are, of course, both historical figures. Socrates himself, the great Athenian philosopher, didn't write any works himself, but instead we get most of his ideas through Plato and some other contemporary figures such as Xenophon and Aristophanes. But Plato gives us by far the most information about Socrates, and it's through Plato's dialogues that we have our kind of conception of Socrates as a philosopher and as a person. So the setting is that Socrates is outside the King Archon's court in Athens awaiting trial. His trial, which is an historical occurrence, was for the crimes, or the supposed crimes, of corrupting the youth and inventing false gods. Now, Socrates actually did neither of these things, or at least it seems fairly clear to most interpreters that Socrates is not guilty of either of these things. Certainly, he himself strenuously denies these charges. To understand why he's on trial, however, it's necessary to go back a little bit in Socrates' personal history. When Socrates was a young man, following his role in the Persian War, he was a soldier who fought for Athens against the Persian Empire, who was invading the Peloponnesian Peninsula and attempting to take over the Greek lands. Following this war, a close friend of Socrates, a young man by the name of Cherephon, went to the oracle at Delphi. Now, the oracle at Delphi was the place to go to get information in the ancient world. There are no schools at this point, right? There are no established centers of learning. The first such was established by Plato, his academy, which is where we get the word academic, right? So the oracle is a way to get information on really anything and everything. When should you plant your crops? Who should train your sons? Should you attempt to gain this or that political position, right? One goes to the oracle and receives prophecy. The oracle is someone who's held to have access to divine revelation, and the oracle gives a pronouncement. So Cherephon goes to the oracle and asks, is any man wiser than Socrates? Even at a young age, Socrates has a reputation for wisdom. He's a very intelligent guy. And the oracle answers, no, no one is wiser than Socrates. Now, Socrates himself is puzzled by this because he's very aware of the extent of his ignorance. In fact, throughout his life, Socrates holds fast to a basic maxim, and that is, I know that I know nothing, right? So he sets himself on a sort of task, or rather he believes that a god has set him on this task. This is a divinely ordained task to find someone wiser than him, and hence show the oracle that, well, you said I was the wisest person, but, look, I found someone wiser. So what he does is he goes around and he asks people questions. He goes to the politicians and he asks them what justice is. He goes to the poets and he asks them what beauty is, right? And so on and so forth. He goes to people who have a reputation for wisdom and understanding to see if he can learn from them, right? And what he finds is that a lot of people think that they know things. They think themselves very wise. But when they're pressed to give clear accounts of their knowledge, they're unable to do so. All it takes is a few pointed questions to untangle their accounts and throw them into a sort of disarray. And Socrates discovers that people aren't really interested in knowing things. They're much more interested in appearing to know things and to rely upon the force of their opinions and established convictions rather than investigating things rationally and hence coming to real knowledge. Now, as a result of doing this, Socrates makes a lot of enemies. Because what he effectively does is he shows a lot of powerful people in Athens that they don't know what they're talking about, that they think they have wisdom, but they do not. And that's not really a way to make allies or friends, right? And so a lot of people begin to be angry at Socrates, and he does this for 50 years. And his reputation as a sort of social and political dissident, or someone who rocks the boat, is established over these decades. And finally, people have had enough, and they decide to take him on in the political arena in order to shut him up and get him out of their way. So his life mission is really to gain wisdom and understanding, and to, at the same time, help his fellow Athenians to cast off the shackles of addiction to wealth and honor and prestige, and instead to live a more introspective and wisdom-loving life, a philosophical life. And he does this again through his patent method of asking questions. Socrates always sticks true to his claim that he knows nothing, right? And so he simply goes and asks questions. And this leads him to the realization that the oracle was in fact correct, that he is the wisest man in Athens, but not because he knows anything worth knowing. Rather, he alone knows that he knows nothing. Everyone else is slave to the bondage of false knowledge. Everyone else believes they have knowledge when in fact they don't. So Socrates is at least wiser than them to the extent that he is aware of the extent of his own ignorance. So the trial was in all likelihood motivated by simple irritation and resentment on the part of various powerful Athenians that Socrates had humiliated. Meanwhile, Euthyphro, a self-proclaimed expert on divine matters, perhaps he's a priest, we really know nothing at all about this person outside of this dialogue. Was he a real historical figure? Most likely, he probably was, because Plato tended to write about real people. But whether or not this is an accurate depiction, we don't know, right? We don't know anything about him. But he's outside the court as well to bring a case of his own. He is bringing a charge of murder against his father for killing a household slave. So this is the setting, right? We have Socrates awaiting his trial and Euthyphro awaiting his indictment against his own father. Now, when Socrates hears why Euthyphro is there, that he's prosecuting his father for murder, he's shocked by this. He says, "Good heavens, certainly, Euthyphro, most men would not know how they could do this and be right. It is not the part of anyone to do this, but of one who is far advanced in wisdom." Now, why is Socrates so shocked? Well, imagine that your father has killed someone, right? Would you prosecute them? I imagine that many of us would, but it wouldn't be an easy decision to make. To go against your parents is a difficult thing to do, and it would take real certainty. I mean, you have to really know, or at least have very strong reasons for believing that your father had actually done something worthy of this prosecution, and that you weren't acting hastily and calling the police and taking them to court, right? And as difficult as it would be for us, it was far more difficult, or perhaps far more shocking, in the ancient world. One doesn't go against their parents. One doesn't go against family. It's a blood crime, right? This is not something that's done. So Socrates is shocked because this is such a hugely surprising thing for Euthyphro to be doing. It violates, huge social taboos. You don't go against your parents, right? So he says this is, not just anyone could do this. Only someone who is very wise would be able to do this and know that they were doing right, right? Euthyphro is quite confident, and he sort of, flippantly replies, "Yes, by Zeus, Socrates, that is so. Yes, I am far advanced in wisdom. I know a lot of things about the gods, about justice, about goodness, about piety, and I'm quite certain I'm doing the right thing here." So this is the background out of which the famous discussion on the notion of piety between Socrates and Euthyphro occurs. Now, piety, what is piety? Well, I mean, that's the topic here, right? That's the question that they're asking and attempting to answer. A general dictionary sort of definition of piety would be something like religious goodness, right? So it's goodness, but with a particular religious sort of slant or angle, right? So, we might say that someone was pious, someone who goes to church, flawlessly, or someone who goes to mass every day, or someone who's very almost kind of like holier than thou is someone who's pious. Someone who is very religiously good. That's the general sense of the word piety. So here's a question, right? Why did Plato choose to present these ideas in dramatic and dialogical form? Dialogical from dialogue, right? Two people discussing. Again, we see logical from the Greek logos, which means a counter explanation. And dia is two. So a dialogue is a dialogos, two logoi, right? Two sets of reason, or two rational individuals, two logical individuals coming together and sort of bouncing ideas off of one another. This is what the word dialogue means. Why didn't Plato simply write an essay on piety if he wanted to discuss the nature of piety? Well, there's probably a few reasons, right? On the one hand, or first, stories lend a dramatic urgency and immediacy to intellectual discussions, right? Reading a dry essay on piety is not nearly as engaging and exciting as being presented with a dialogue, with a dramatic scene, right, in which we have characters who are engaged in the real business of living. And this is a way to highlight the live importance of philosophical discussions, right? They're not just abstractly interesting, they're existentially and immediately interesting. Plato is telling us something with these particular details, right? This particular setting, why Socrates is there and why Euthyphro is there. Those details are very important to the overall account. And if you think about it, two lives hang in the balance here. Socrates goes on to be found guilty and to be put to death by drinking hemlock, right? But also, Euthyphro's father's life hangs in the balance, right? If he's found guilty of murder, the penalty is generally death, right? So how we define piety, which is what they're really both on trial for violating, right? Socrates is on trial for violating, the piety demanded by the state, by the city, in relation to the gods and the youth, right? And Euthyphro's father is held to have, by Euthyphro at least, violated the demands of piety or goodness by killing a household servant. So it's going to turn out that two lives hang in the balance, right? How we define piety, whether or not these two men have been impious, is going to dictate whether or not they live or die. Right? These are not just abstract concerns. These are matters quite literally of life and death. People live or die based upon how we define these types of terms. So, what is the pious? Euthyphro claims he knows. He claims to be an expert on piety, such that he's not in any doubt about his course of action. He knows he's doing the right thing, so he says. So Socrates, taking him at his word, says, "Tell me now, by Zeus, what you just now maintained you clearly knew. What kind of thing do you say that godliness and ungodliness are, both as regards murder and other things? Or is the pious not the same and alike in every action, and the impious the opposite of all that is pious and like itself, and everything that is to be impious presents us with one form or appearance insofar as it is impious?" Euthyphro responds, "Most certainly, Socrates." Socrates, asking a very basic question here that Euthyphro should have no trouble answering. By his own accounts, he's an expert on these things. "Tell me then, what is the pious and what the impious do you say?" It's, one couldn't imagine a more basic question that Euthyphro ought to be able to answer immediately and with no hesitation. After all, he himself has just declared that he's an expert on these things. Euthyphro responds, "I say that the pious is to do what I am doing now, to prosecute the wrongdoer, be it about murder or temple robbery or anything else. Not to prosecute is impious." Okay, so what's wrong with this answer? There's something very wrong with this answer, very unsatisfactory about this answer. We'll call this his first strike, or the strike one for Euthyphro's attempt to give an account of the pious. What Socrates has asked Euthyphro for is a definition. Tell me what the pious is and what the impious. Instead of giving him one, Euthyphro instead gives Socrates an example. An example is not a definition. So let's take a particular case here. Suppose someone had never before seen or heard of dogs, right? They're not familiar with, dogs. They don't know what dogs are. Maybe it's kind of hard to fathom, but it's certainly possible, right? For the sake of the argument, just assume that there's this person who's never seen or heard of dogs before. They have no familiarity with this animal whatsoever. So they come to you and they ask, "What is dog? I keep hearing about dogs. What are dogs? What does that word mean?" You reply, "A golden retriever is a dog," and you show them a picture of a golden retriever. They say, "Ah, I understand. Dog is identical to golden retriever. All golden retrievers are dogs and all dogs are golden retrievers. It's the same thing." You say, no, that's not what I meant. There are other dogs too." Well, this person would be right to reply, "Okay, well, you didn't answer my question then, right? I did not ask for an example of one particular dog or one type of dog, but I asked about that form through which all dogs are dogs, the essence or general definition that holds true of every dog, right?" So what we're asking for here is what Plato calls a form. And the word form in Greek is eidos. That's where we get the word idea. And it means something like essence or general nature, right? What is that form, that essence that holds true of all dogs, right? Not just one or two or several, right? In the same way, Socrates replies to Euthyphro by pointing out that there are many pious actions in addition to prosecuting wrongdoers, right? Euthyphro said that the pious is to prosecute wrongdoers, but certainly prayer is also pious. Making sacrifice at the temple is also pious. Heeding the words and advice of the gods is also pious. So there's other pious things besides prosecuting wrongdoers. And Euthyphro, of course, agrees. Therefore, prosecuting wrongdoers cannot be the definition of piety. Instead, it's one particular case of piety. When Euthyphro agrees, Socrates says, "Bear in mind, then, that I did not bid you to tell me one or two of the many pious actions, but that form itself that makes all pious actions pious. Tell me what this form itself is, so that I may look upon it, and using it as a model, say that any action of yours or another's that is of that kind is pious, and if it is not, that it is not." So to go back to our dog example, right, what we would be asking for here is, give me a general definition of dog such that I can use it in order to judge this or that new animal that I've never seen before and say whether or not it's a dog, right? What makes a dog different than a wolf or a fox? They look quite similar, but wolves and foxes aren't dogs, right? Why not? What's the essence or general nature of dogs such that this thing is a dog here and that thing over there is not? Euthyphro now tries again, right? Having been chastised in his initial attempt, which again, he shouldn't have failed at all if he really knows clearly what piety is, but he did, right? So he tries again, and he says, "What is dear to the gods is pious, what is not is impious." Socrates replies, "Splendid, Euthyphro, you have now answered in the way I wanted. Whether your answer is true, I do not yet know, but you will obviously show me that what you say is true." So Socrates says, okay, good. That at least has the form of a correct answer. You've actually given me a definition. Now, I don't know if it's a good definition yet, or if your account is true, but at least you've not, fumbled at the very first attempt and, given me something other than a definition. Now we have to see if whether what you say is true or not. "Certainly," says Euthyphro, once again, supremely and misguidedly confident. Socrates continues, "Come then, let us examine what we mean. An action or a man dear to the gods is pious, but an action or a man hated by the gods is impious. They are not the same, but quite opposite, the pious and the impious. Is that not so?" Euthyphro agrees that it is so, of course, because Socrates is pointing out a well-known fact, and one that's actually already been mentioned in the course of this discussion. Namely that the gods are in a state of discord. They war constantly and are in disagreement and conflict with one another, right? The gods are always disagreeing. Now, Socrates asks a question. He asks, what are the subjects of difference that cause hatred and anger, right? What is it that we tend to disagree about in such a way that we become angry with one another? We don't become angry when we discuss with one another about numbers or weights or measurements, right? If me and someone else have a disagreement about how much a given object weighs, we're not likely to sort of fly off the handle and start screaming in each other's faces, right? Instead, we'd go to a scale, we'd weigh the object, and then we'd be reconciled, right? If we disagreed about how long something was, right, we wouldn't become angry. If we disagreed, we'd find a ruler or a measuring tape, and we'd measure it, and we'd be reconciled. So on with anything that's easily adjudicated or solved in this manner. The subjects instead that we tend to argue about are questions of right and wrong, good and bad, beautiful and ugly, questions about morality, questions about religion, questions about politics. We become angry whenever we do, right? When we disagree about these types of value-laden questions. Questions of value tend to cause hatred and discord, not questions of weights or measurements. And if this is true of us, it will also, of course, be true of the gods. The Greek gods are very much like human beings. They're bigger, stronger, more powerful versions of human beings. So they too, when they tend to disagree, which they obviously do, will disagree about questions of right and wrong, good and bad, beautiful and ugly, i.e. questions of value. But if that's true, then it would seem that one and the same thing will be God loved and God hated, because the gods do disagree and disagree in a contentious and quarrelsome way, right? And those things that cause contention and quarrel are questions of value, right? So the gods will be in disagreement about questions of value. All right, take one very basic example, adultery. Zeus, the king of the gods, is a chronic adulterer. He's always cheating on his wife Hera. So we could fairly say that adultery is loved by Zeus, right? But Hera hates it when her husband commits adultery, so adultery is hated by Hera. But what that seems to mean is that adultery is both God loved and God hated, loved by one god, hated by another. But if that's the case, then according to Euthyphro's definition that the pious is the God loved and the impious is the God hated, then the same thing, in this case adultery, will be simultaneously pious and impious. But that makes no sense, obviously. Euthyphro himself has just agreed that the pious is the opposite of the impious. They can't be the same thing, right? But according to his definition of piety as what the gods love, we'd have to conclude that one and the same thing could be both pious and impious, and we're thrown into a sort of moral schizophrenia here. So strike two. So we then propose, Socrates really proposes this amendment to the definition, and Euthyphro accepts it. Socrates basically says, okay, well, you fumbled the ball again, but let me help you out a little bit here, right? Perhaps we should make the following correction, right? That what all the gods love, that what all the gods hate is impious, and what they all love is pious, and that what some gods love and others hate is neither or both. Is that how you now wish us to define piety and impiety? So essentially, Socrates is stepping in here and doing Euthyphro's job for him. Euthyphro is the one who claimed to know what piety and impiety were, right? And when he's fumbled the ball twice now, and so Socrates says, "All right, man, let me help you out. Why don't we say this? Why don't we say that what all the gods love is the pious, right? Would that be a good amendment to your definition?" Euthyphro responds by asking a question. Well, what prevents us from doing so, Socrates, right? He's obviously in way over his head. All right, well, sure, why don't we do that, right? Well, you're supposed to be the expert here, man, right? So Socrates replies, well, for my part, nothing, Euthyphro. I mean, this is your account, dude. So for my part, nothing, but you look whether on your part this proposal will enable you to teach me most easily what you promised. You're the one who promised to teach me what piety is, right? I'm doing the work for you, and you're like, yeah, sure, let's do that. It's like, okay, I thought you were the expert, but if that's going to allow you to teach me what piety is, then sure, let's do that, right? Now note here that Socrates is being rather sarcastic and ironic. And this is the way Socrates is, right? He teaches through irony, through sarcasm, and through sort of baiting his opponents into making mistakes. He doesn't really think that Euthyphro is going to be able to teach him anything at all. He's lived too long and seen too many would-be experts fail to believe that that's going to happen. But he's, continues on because Euthyphro continues to claim he knows what it is. So Socrates, takes him at his word and says, all right, teach me what it is. I'm about to go on trial for impiety. This could really help me out, right? Again, it's ironic, but it's for a purpose, right? He's trying to illustrate to Euthyphro that he doesn't know as much as he thinks he knows, and that he's potentially about to make a huge mistake in bringing his father to trial for murder on the basis of really no expertise at all about such things. So Euthyphro, suddenly filled with confidence again, says, well, I would certainly say that the pious is what all the gods love, and the opposite, what all the gods hate, is the impious. Socrates this is a beautiful line, right? He says, then let us examine whether that is a sound statement. Or do we let it pass? And if one of us, or someone else, merely says that something is so, do we accept that it is so? Or should we examine what the speaker means? This is really lovely. This is a very nice and sort of crystallized statement on what it is to be a critical thinker and to do philosophy, right? We shouldn't just accept what people say when they say it, right? People say all sorts of things. Everybody's got something to sell you. Everybody's got something they're trying to convince you of, right? And if you listen to everybody, you'll end up having no opinion at all, right? You can't just accept what people say. You have to critically analyze what they say to see if it holds water, to see if it makes sense, right? Socrates says, well, okay, fine, right? This is your new definition, right? You've tried twice so far and failed twice. So let's analyze this and see if it holds up under sustained scrutiny. We can't just accept what someone says. Euthyphro, once again, supremely confident, even though he's had to, been helped to this definition after several fumbles, Says, well, we must examine it. Sure, I mean, I guess, right? But I certainly think that this is now a fine statement. Socrates says, we shall soon know better whether it is, right? So everything up to this point has in a way been a sort of prelude to the real discussion. The real discussion and the real sticking point of this dialogue is what's coming now. The central question of the dialogue, Socrates now poses it, and it is this. Is the pious being loved by the gods because it is pious, or is it pious because it is loved by the gods, right? So for the sake of dialogue, Socrates is now provisionally accepting this new amended definition. All right, given your definition of the pious as what all the gods love, here's a question. Is the pious loved by the gods because it is pious? Or, on the other hand, is it pious because it is loved by the gods? Right? Now, what is Socrates asking here? Right, really think about this because this is the core question of the dialogue. And it's an extremely important question, not just for the sake of defining piety, but for religious ethics in general. Well, Euthyphro is confused, right? He says, I don't know what you mean, Socrates. Socrates says, well, let me try to clarify for you. I'll give you some examples. For instance, we speak of something carried and something carrying, right? He gives many other examples too, something led and something leading, something seen and something seeing. But for the sake of, clarity here, let's just focus in on carried and carrying, right? We speak of something carried and something carrying. In the image here, this man is carrying the briefcase, right? He is carrying the briefcase. In other words, he is doing something to change or affect the briefcase, right? The briefcase is undergoing a change or an affection, right? As a result of this change or affection, right, the briefcase is a carried thing. As a result of the man carrying it, the briefcase is said truly to be a carried thing. Now, the man is not carrying the briefcase because it is a carried thing, right? Rather, the briefcase is a carried thing because the man is carrying it, right? This is what I've called in the title above a dependence relation, right? Why does the man carry the briefcase? Well, presumably because it has his stuff in it and he needs to move his stuff from point A to point B. But whatever his reasons, he's not carrying the briefcase because it's a carried thing, right? That's not the way that change and dependence work. It's a carried thing because he is carrying it, right? It's not as though he sees the briefcase and says, oh, it's one of those carried things. Well, I know what to do with that. And he picks it up and carries it. No, right? He carries it because he needs it, right? He needs it for work or whatever, right? And as a result of his carrying it, it now has the status of being a carried thing, and for no other reason. It'll of course be the same with love, because to love something is to change or affect it, just like to carry something is to change or affect it. So let us take an example, Tommy and his teddy bear. So here's Tommy and his teddy bear. Tommy loves his teddy bear. As a result, the teddy bear is Tommy loved, right? Sounds strange to say that, but again, it's a perfectly legitimate thing to say. The bear is loved by Tommy, hence we can say the bear is Tommy loved. Now, why does Tommy love his teddy bear? Well, we don't know the particulars, but we can guess, right, based on what we know about human nature and children and so on. Most likely he loves the bear because the bear is fuzzy and cute and comforting to Tommy, right? Because his mom gave it to him, right? Or for whatever other reason, right? But it's going to be something in that ballpark, right? Because, the bear is a comfort. The bear is a fun little friend for Tommy to have. That's why Tommy loves the teddy bear. One thing we can say for certain is that Tommy does not love his teddy bear because his teddy bear is Tommy loved, right? The causal arrow runs the other way. The teddy bear is Tommy loved because Tommy loves it. Tommy does not love the teddy bear because it's Tommy loved, right? Now, again, the verbiage here can get, the words here can get a little confusing, but the core message is just quite simple, right? And it is that things that are changed or affected have the status of being changed or affected because they are changed or affected. They are not changed or affected because they have the status of being changed or affected. I don't carry a briefcase because it's a carried thing. It's a carried thing because I carry it. Tommy doesn't love Teddy because Teddy is Tommy loved. Teddy is Tommy loved because Tommy loves Teddy. Just a basic analysis of the way in which we speak about change and affection. So, with that analysis in our hip pocket, let's go back to our central definition here. We'll call this definition D. And we'll simplify it as follows. The pious is the God loved, right? Whereby God loved we mean is what all the gods love, right? So here we are just returning to Euthyphro's central definition. The pious is what all the gods love. The impious is what all the gods hate. That's the story that Euthyphro wants to stick to. And to analyze it further, Socrates has asked his central question. Do the gods love the pious because it's pious? Or is the pious pious because the gods love it? Given the foregoing analysis, consider the following two questions. Why do the gods love the pious? Well, in the course of discussion, Euthyphro agrees that it is because the pious is pious, and for no other reason. Thus, we get what we'll call P1 or premise 1, or rather proposition 1, right? The gods love the pious because it is pious, right? Now, pause for a moment and think about the general question again. When Socrates asks Euthyphro, do the gods love the pious because it's pious, or is it pious because the gods love it? He's asking about whether or not piety is something like an intrinsic quality had by certain objects, or whether it's a derivative quality that's only there because the gods happen to love this or that, right? Which one, so is it a dependence thing? Is it a dependent claim or a dependent quality that depends upon the god's love? Or is it an intrinsic quality that is the cause of the god's love? Well, here Euthyphro goes for the second of those options. He says it's an intrinsic quality of some things. Some things are just intrinsically pious, and that's why the gods love them. Okay? So some things are just pious, and that's why the gods love them. Now we can ask, why do the gods love the God loved? Right? Why do they love the things that they love? Well, again, we're not sure, but we know it isn't because it is God loved, given our foregoing analysis of carried, of briefcases and teddy bears, right? To say that the gods love the God loved because it's God loved would be like saying a child loves a teddy bear because it is child loved, or a book is a carried thing. A book is carried because it's a carried thing, right? We don't speak that way, right? People don't carry briefcases because they're carried things, and children don't love teddy bears because they're loved things. That's just not the way change or affection works. Thus, we can of course conclude, in line with those findings, that the gods do not love the God loved because it is God loved. They love them for independent reasons, right? So we have two propositions here. One, the gods love the pious because it is pious. Two, the gods do not love the God loved because it is God loved. Euthyphro assents to both of these propositions. He agrees to both P1 and P2. But this shows us that the pious is not identical to the God loved. Euthyphro has once again struck out, right? For consider that on Euthyphro's definition D, the pious is the God loved. Or more simply, we can simply put it as the pious is equal to the God loved, right? To see why this definition creates a contradiction with P1 and P2, let us simply insert the words the pious every time we see the phrase God loved within P2, which after all is allowed because on Euthyphro's definition, the pious is equal to the God loved or identical to the God loved. So if we do that, we get proposition 1, the gods love the pious because it is pious, to which Euthyphro agrees. Proposition 2, which we've amended, the gods do not love the pious because it is pious. You see what's happened here? People don't love things because they're loved by them. They love them for independent reasons, right? But Euthyphro has said that the gods love the pious because it's pious. But if the pious is identical to the God loved, right, then by saying the gods love the pious because it is pious, we would implicitly be saying the gods love the God loved because it's God loved, right? But that's nonsense. We don't say that, right? Therefore, we would have to conclude that the gods do not love the God loved because it is God loved, right? But since God loved is the same as the pious, according to Euthyphro, what we have here is the gods love the pious because it is pious, and the gods do not love the pious because it is pious, which is a contradiction. Socrates, through a brief investigation of common sense notions of change and affection, has led Euthyphro to see that his definition is untenable, right? Euthyphro has contradicted himself. Now, just notice how strong Socrates' argumentative position is here, right? It's so strong because at no point has Socrates put forward his own view, right? If you want to get really good at debate, really good at argument, you need to try to emulate Socrates' method, right? The best debaters in the world know how to ask pointed questions, right? If it's just two people spouting their opinions at one another, it's not really even a debate or a dialogue. It's just two people, yelling at each other. A good way to debate, the best way to debate, is to ask questions that show forth the weakness in your opponent's position. If you can show that they don't even know what they're talking about, that's far more powerful than simply saying, I disagree with you and here's why. At no point has Socrates said, I disagree with you, Euthyphro, here's my view on piety. He simply led Euthyphro to see that Euthyphro's own definition doesn't withstand logical scrutiny. So, we'll end our analysis of the dialogue there and move into a sort of more general application of this dilemma to ethics and religious ethics or theological ethics in particular, right? The question discussed here by Socrates and Euthyphro becomes a general dilemma for theology, appropriately called the Euthyphro dilemma. It can be formulated as follows. Does God command goodness because it is good, or is goodness good because God commands it? All right, so now we've moved past the sort of polytheistic, many gods view of the Greeks, and we can have this discussion on a monotheistic Judeo-Christian Islamic scheme. It can also be a question for Hinduism or really any religion that holds there to be an overarching singular godhead. There are many gods in Hinduism, but they're all sort of swept up into the unity of God, Brahman, right? So this is going to be a question for really any religion that holds that there's a single God ultimately that has a unique relationship to right and wrong, right? Or is somehow uniquely responsible for morality, right? So does God command goodness or love goodness or whatever because it is good, or is goodness good because God commands it? Any theological ethic, right, or any ethic that is grounded in a theos, right, a God, right, is going to hold there to be a very tight connection between God and goodness. So the question is a very natural one. And it would seem there's two options. One, God commands the good because it is good. Or two, the good is good because God commands it. So take a particular commandment, it might help, right, to see what's up here. Take the commandment given by the God of Abraham to Moses, thou shalt not kill, right? Now, this is a command that's generally held to be a moral truth or a real moral command or imperative by most world religions, if not all, right? So the question is, why did God command us not to kill, right? And again, all of this on the assumption that there is a God and so on and so forth, right? Why does God command that we not kill? Is it because killing is intrinsically bad, right? Or in other words, is it intrinsically good not to kill and that's why God commands it? Or does the command have force simply because God commanded it? Well, let's start with option one. Option one was God commands the good because it is good, right? God commands the good because it is good, or God loves the good because it is good, whatever verb we want to pick here, but command seems, appropriate. Well, what's the problem with this? I mean, this is a dilemma, right? This is the Euthyphro dilemma, and a dilemma is something to which it's a question to which there appears to be no good answer, right? That both answers seem problematic, right? Well, why is there a problem with this option? Well, the God of Abraham, right, as well as the God of Hinduism, right, the God of the West, and the God of Hinduism and really many other conceptions of God, is supposed to be omnipotent, right, which means all-powerful, right, as well as omniscient, all-knowing, omnipresent, everywhere at once somehow, and omnibenevolent, all good. God is supposed to be the cause and source of everything. If God commands the good because it is good, it seems that what that means is that God answers to an outside source and is not God at all, right? That somehow God is beholden to an external or foreign moral law. If God commands the good because it's good, right, then really God isn't God. God is simply a middleman, right? A sort of middle management figure. And the good, whatever that is ultimately, God. And if we try that, we say, well, that's actually God. Then we might say something like, well, why does the good command the good, right? Is it because it's good or the other way around? And the same issue, the same dilemma reduplicates itself, right? So we can't solve it that way. So if option one is the one we pick, then it seems like it reduces God to someone of lesser importance, i.e. it makes God not God. Well, so maybe we want to try option two, right? And say that the good is good because God commands it, right? The good is good because God commands it. God doesn't answer to any external goodness. His command is what makes goodness good. Well, this option seems to safeguard God's supremacy, right? But at a fairly large cost, the cost of making God wholly arbitrary, right? If goodness is good simply because God said it, God could just as easily have commanded, thou shalt kill, as thou shalt not kill, right? Let me give you an example here. Suppose, think back to when you were a child. When you're a kid, there's many rules that at least most households have. Your parents most likely gave you rules that you had to follow, right? So, one very common rule that I had to follow as a kid was that I had to brush my teeth every night before bed, right? So I have to brush my teeth. Now, when I'm a small child, when I was a kid, I didn't see the point in it. I didn't want to do it. I didn't like brushing my teeth like most kids. And so I'd often try to get away with not doing it, right? And when my mom would catch me and say, no, go in there and brush your teeth, I probably said, why do I have to do this? This is stupid. Why? Why should I? Right? Now, my mom would often say what all parents say from time to time, namely, because I said so, right? Now, it's a frustrating answer to get as a kid, right? Because it seems arbitrary, right? Because I said so. I mean, who are you? Who are you to tell me to do this sort of thing, right? It seems arbitrary. Now, of course, the command or the rule to brush my teeth was not arbitrary. There are very good reasons for it. It's not an arbitrary command. It's grounded in facts about dental hygiene, right? The very real possibility of cavities and tooth problems and so on and so forth, right? So there are plenty of good reasons for the command to brush my teeth. But when I'm 4 years old, I'm not really in a position to understand dental hygiene. If my mom were to sit me down and explain it, I would have just, it would have gone over my head. I was 4, I didn't know anything, right? So instead, my mom very plausibly and correctly simply said, because I said so, just go do it, right? I'm bigger than you, you have to, right? And that's perfectly fine to do, for a child. But when we're adults and someone tells us to do something and we say why, and they say because I said so, that's hugely vexing, right? If, for instance, I were to command you all to write me a 300-page paper, you would rightly say, why should we do that? And if I said, because I said so, you'd say, that's ridiculous. I'm going to, an ombudsman or the dean of students. I'm talking to somebody because there's no way I'm writing a 300-page paper. And you'd be right to do so because there is no good reason for you to write a 300-page paper for this class. It would be totally arbitrary, right? So instead of just brushing my teeth, imagine that my mom had given me the following rule. Imagine she had said, what you need to do, what I command you to do, is to brush your teeth for 2 hours every night while standing on one foot and wearing a top hat, right? Now, that's bizarre, and that would be wholly arbitrary. If I were to ask, why should I do that? The only possible answer that could be given is because I said so. Because there is no good reason for that command. In fact, there are plenty of reasons not to do that. You brush your teeth for that long, your teeth are going to fall out, right? It would be hugely harmful to your dental hygiene and your health, on the whole. Standing on one leg for that long is going to give you scoliosis, and, if you have to wear a top hat, you're probably going to have some weird psychological disorder relating to hats, right? Anyway, it's going to be problems all around. It's not going to be good, right? There's no good reason for that type of command, right? So notice that if we take option 2, it makes every command of God's equally arbitrary. Thou shalt kill would be just as arbitrary as thou shalt not kill, right? Because prior to God saying so, nothing is either good or bad. Goodness and badness are simply and solely a result of God saying this is good and that is bad. If God had said genocide was good, genocide would be good. If God had said that torture was good, torture would be good, right? Because goodness and badness would simply and solely be a result of God's arbitrary will, arbitrary volition or choice. Right? Since goodness would, another way to put it, since goodness is a downstream quality arising from God's arbitrary volitions, whatever God chose would have been good. And notice that sometimes people try to get out of this by saying something like, well, God would only choose what was good. You can't say that here, right? Because then we're back to the problem with option one of presupposing an existing moral code that exists independently of God, right? To say God would only choose what was good, no, that's precisely what's put out of bounds if we choose option two, right? Because prior to God choosing, there is nothing that's good, right? God created goodness. And God would have no reason to choose one thing over another and call it good, except whatever arbitrary volition God chose to follow, whatever arbitrary choice He chose to make, right? So we can't presuppose that His choices will always be good, if by good we mean some independently existing standard. Then we're just back to option one, and we're not choosing option two at all. So what do we do here? We have a dilemma, right? Either we make God a secondary figure, but we safeguard, the sort of natural sensibility of good being good and bad being bad, or evil being evil, or we safeguard God's supremacy at the cost of good and evil becoming totally arbitrary and rooted in nothing but God's happenstance choice. Well, a few hundred years later, a few hundred years, around 600 years actually, after Socrates and Euthyphro have this discussion, an early Christian theologian by the name of St. Augustine proposes, not directly, but proposes a theory of God, right, that allows us to see a possible solution here. So St. Augustine is an early Christian philosopher and theologian, right? 300s AD we're talking, right? So 300, around 400 AD is when Augustine lives and does his work. He's one of the most important thinkers in the history of Christendom. And in his thought, we find a solution to this dilemma. Again, he doesn't address it and solve it directly, but his thought provides a very compelling way out of this dilemma. St. Augustine and other philosophers after him, such as Boethius, St. Thomas Aquinas, and many others, argue that God and goodness are not distinct things. They're not separate substances or realities. Now, how does this help us? Well, it helps us because this dilemma arises only if we think of God and goodness as separate substances, entities, or realities, for then one would have to be subordinate to the other, right? It's only if we think of God and goodness as being different things that we have a problem, because then either we have to pick option one, in which case goodness is over or above God, or option two, in which God is over or above goodness, right? But if we see that they're not separate things, the dilemma disappears. Augustine argues that God is the good. God is the good. They're not distinct things. And if God is the good, then one doesn't have to be subordinate to the other because they're not distinct things. So if this is true, then the dilemma dissolves or disappears. For God is no longer bound by something outside of himself, as was the case in option one, nor does he arbitrarily will this or that command, option two, because he is bound to and by his own perfect moral nature, right? So here God is bound by something, right? He does answer to something. He answers to goodness. But insofar as goodness is not separate from God, God is bound to and by only his own nature. And that's not an imperfection. It is not an imperfection to be bound by one's own nature, that is, to be what one is, right? It's only an imperfection in God's nature if God was bound to something external to God. But if God is bound by and to only his own perfect moral nature, then we have no dilemma at all, right? So this is a fascinating moral dilemma, moral quandary, or apparent moral quandary, and it comes right down to the heart of what we think we mean when we say that God has some connection to morality, or that morality is grounded in God, and it's worthy of serious consideration. Now, St. Augustine's solution here, just by saying God is the good, well, there's still many questions we might have. What exactly does it mean to say God is the good, right? In what sense is God the good? Is goodness one of God's ideas? Is it wound up with his abstract nature? So the work isn't done here, right? Augustine's solution is a starting point for working through these issues, not the final word. We need to be willing to think through, if we want to be theological ethicists, what exactly it means to say this. All right, thanks for listening. I will see you next time.